On today's episode of interviewing people that are much smarter than me, I interview my friend, Natasha Crain. But no, I'm very serious. You should probably stop this video right now and go follow her because she is much smarter than me. She also wrote a book, one of many, called When Culture Hates You. I read this book before it was out. I had the great honor of endorsing it. And I know I say this about all of Natasha's books, but it's one of my favorites. Natasha Crain is one of my own personal favorite authors, so I'm very glad when I get to interview her about the things that she's written about. But one thing that I love about the way that Natasha Crain writes is she pulls no punches. There are topics in this book that I haven't personally seen a lot of people go into great detail on. One of them is Christian nationalism, among many other topics that she covers. But everybody's wondering about this lately. It's a hot topic right now. What is it? Is it bad? Is it good? What does the media mean when they use this? A lot of the things that she covers, though, is really about just legislating morality and what it means to be a part of the common good, to work for the common good. She defines that and more. And there's another topic that I ask her about that when I first read her book, I was absolutely shocked that this is even a thing. And it's about normalizing, how to put this, basically normalizing pedophilia. There is disturbingly a growing group of activists. They see it as sexual liberation. And you know what? We need to talk about this. We need to get these types of conversations out there in the public square to point this out, that this is happening and what we can do about this. So be sure to check out the description for more information. You will find a link to Natasha's book, along with other resources that I think would be helpful for you about these topics. Natasha, I want to thank you so much for coming on my channel today to talk about your book, When Culture Hates You. I know that I will have already probably said this in the intro, but you are one of my favorite authors, and I love everything that you write because not only is it relevant, but it's extremely well written in a way that we can all understand, but you also are not afraid to go after these tough topics that everybody's asking about. So I want to thank you so much for coming on my channel and for writing this book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you. I always love talking to you. We have so much fun together.
Well, let's jump right in. Okay, so I have a list of questions here for you, and we're just going to kind of go wherever it goes because I've read your book and I've endorsed your book, and there really is so many topics that we can hit on, but there's a few topics that I really want to zone in on that I think my viewers would love. But first, let's start with a overall environmental issue that maybe Christians are having, which has to do with the title of your book. You said that there's why culture hates you, right? So there's this culture of hate, so to speak, coming towards Christians. So what does that mean? And why do you think that we are increasingly seeing that in our culture?
Yeah, so I noticed a couple of years ago that increasingly when I was out talking with people and doing conferences and speaking events, things like that, engaging with people online, that people were noticing that there's this increasing hostility in the culture at large, but also in their personal lives. So a lot of people were experiencing the effects of the cultural situation in ways that would lead to family members cutting them off for their beliefs, from friends cutting them off, from some really heated debates that they would get into with people. People were losing jobs. Sometimes people are having trouble getting jobs in the first place. And so I started to notice that people were experiencing this in a lot of ways. And they were saying, but I don't understand how I can address this because it's not just that culture thinks that we're wrong about these things. It's that culture thinks that we're awful, that we're just terrible people, that we're toxic and harmful and all of these things to the degree that they're saying, hey, we're just going to cut you off. We're going to get rid of you from our lives. And so I noticed that a lot of people were struggling with understanding where that hostility comes from. And at the same time, I started seeing that a lot of people were kind of wanting to shy away from speaking up about their faith in the culture, because obviously no one wants to be hated. No one wants to have these things happen. And so I kind of pulled those themes together for this book so that I could help make sense of the hostility that we're seeing in culture. Why are we seeing this? And kind of just give people what one of my reviewers said, a kick in the pants. That's how she felt after reading this book. Like she said, this book was a kick in the pants and an encouragement at the same time to say, hey, yes, the culture is going to hate us. Jesus actually warned that culture would hate his disciples, his followers. Jesus said this was going to happen, but yet we're still called to be salt and light. We are still called to be the ones who are out there preserving the world and exposing the darkness for what it is. So people are experiencing this on a personal level. We're seeing it on a broader level in culture. And I don't know if you want to talk about some of the statistics. We can do that if you want. But I mean, some of that is into it.
This is one thing I love about your writing is, the statistics are very memorable. I could probably still quote some stats from your other book, Faithfully Different. Give me some stats. Talk about that.
Yeah, just some basic stats, not to get too deep into it. And like you said, I go deep into that in Faithfully Different especially, but just to lay a foundation for why we're starting to see more of the hostility in culture. We know from the research that if you go out and you ask people, hey, how do you identify yourself? Are you a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, a Jew, etc., that about 65% of Americans will say, hey, I'm a Christian. So self-identified Christians.
Yes.
But as we know, you can label yourself anything, right? So that is somewhat meaningless to us in terms of evaluating the culture. What's more interesting is that we have other research that tells us what percent of people have what can be considered a biblical worldview. In other words, according to researchers, it represents, if we give you dozens of questions about your beliefs and we look at, do 80% of your answers, at least 80% of your answers line up with what the Bible teaches? What we find from that research is that only about 4% of Americans have a biblical worldview. So 4% of people see all of reality or most of reality through the lens of what the Bible teaches. And we have this huge gap between that and the 65% who call themselves Christians. And that is rapidly decreasing also. The percent of people with a biblical worldview has decreased significantly over the last 25 years. So in America in particular, that makes sense of why we're starting to see that, wait a second, it's not just as comfortable and as easy as it used to be a Christian. There are more people who at least used to nominally associate with Christianity. And today that's not the case. And so as fewer and fewer people associate themselves with Christianity, we're going to see more of this, that there's going to be more open hostility to our beliefs. But like I said earlier, Jesus himself told us this was going to happen, right? He said that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So he explained that there's always going to be this hostility between those who are of the world, meaning those who are slaves to sin under the governing rule of Satan, and those who are children of God, who are slaves to righteousness, as the Bible puts it. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us that as more people are becoming enslaved to sin, that we're going to see this hostility toward those who are children of God. It makes sense. Jesus told us it would happen, and we're seeing the effects of it today.
Why do you think people hated Jesus?
Well, in that verse that I just quoted, he says that it's about being of the world. So that is the key distinction, I think, that we see repeatedly in Scripture. And that's so important because we could, if Jesus just said, the world's going to hate you, didn't give any explanation, we'd kind of be having to come up with our own understanding of that, right? Yeah. But he specifically gave us the explanation that those who are of the world are the ones who are going to hate the ones who are children of God. So it's really important that we understand that that is the connection. And when culture hates you, I tie all of these passages together that we can pull from the entire New Testament, really, that speak to that people who are enslaved to sin are going to hate it when you shine a light on that darkness. It makes sense, right? No, evil wants to hide on its own. And ultimately, if you're enslaved to sin, if you're under the governing rule of Satan, you want to go your own way. You want to be your own authority, your own boss. You want to do your own thing. That's what it's not about doing Satan's will in particular. It's doing your own will because that's what Satan wants, right? So if you're a child of God who looks to God as your authority and you're doing what God wants, those things are going to be in conflict. And so no one wants to have the light shined on their darkness. Yes. No one wants that. And so they ultimately, yes, culture is going to hate Christians, but ultimately they hate God. Ultimately, they hate God because he is the authority and they're not. We're just his messengers.
That's so good. Yes. Okay. So I have an offshoot question from here. Because when I was reading your book, there was one thing that I kept thinking about, and I was trying to think of a way to put it in a categorical kind of question. Can you define the difference between a what did I write down? It's the martyr, I'm going to call it like a martyr complex hate, right? Where you have Christians that, oh, everybody's going to hate me. I'm just speaking truth. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But they almost don't feel like they're doing God's will unless they're being hated versus like a biblical hate that Jesus talks about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't been asked that before. I do think that you see some people in culture that are seeking, or they cry persecution on everything, right? There
Yes.
are a
Yes.
few of those cases
Mhm.
excuse me, where you see Christians who are saying, oh, this Facebook post did not get shown, therefore, the culture hates me, therefore there is persecution. Now, you and I both know that there have definitely been many examples where that certain posts on social media
Yeah.
are getting pushed down the algorithms because of the content. So I'm not suggesting that's not the case, but I'm just saying that sometimes we can overreact to things and
Yes.
think that, this is the world is coming out for us, and those kinds of things. And I think we have to be careful in saying that. But I think that because Jesus tells us specifically why we'll be hated, we
Yes.
know that this is going to come. You don't have to seek it. It's going to come when you're doing what we are called to do. So
Yeah.
we need to be the ones who are speaking up and sharing truth, knowing that there's also a really good possibility that some people are going to hate us for it. So it's not that you seek the hate and seek
Mhm.
the suffering, it's that you seek out of obedience to live the way that God wants us to, and knowing that that can be an outcome of it. So I think there's a difference between knowing that's going to be a likely outcome of what you do and seeking the outcome itself. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Oh, it does. Yeah. And I think that you do a good job of kind of explaining, like even the stats that you just gave, that there's a minority there with the Christian biblical worldview. And if you believe what the Bible teaches, that's in the minority, in that regard. So I think that that kind of speaks for itself too. Now,
Well,
another thing
I
I just
think
want,
if I could just add one thing to that too, I
sure.
think that a lot of non-believers, I think that they hear the title of a book like "When Culture Hates You," and they think that we're all just a bunch of whiny crybabies. So I know that, in fact, there's already one review on Goodreads that
Yeah,
gave my book a 1 star, and clearly she didn't read it. But
clearly.
it was like, it's propaganda. The culture doesn't hate you. They hate Christians. Christians are the ones who are bigots, and this is exactly proving the point, right?
Yeah.
This is exactly what I'm saying. And so, and I've seen a few skeptics, when people share
The
about my
irony.
book on
Yeah.
X, and especially that non-believers will come along and they really hate the title of the book. Which is interesting to me because they really hate this idea that Christians are the hated ones because they
Yes.
think we're the haters, right? And
Yes.
that's the whole purpose of the book,
Yes.
is to explain why the culture hates us on those topics, and yet they're the ones coming along and saying, hey, no one hates you, stop with the persecution complex and that kind of thing. So
While
there's a
they go
great
along
irony
telling
there.
you why they hate you.
Yes, that's exactly right. So yeah, so it'll be fun to see how many interesting reviews that I get just on the title of the book. They're like reviewing the title, not the book itself.
Yes. You know what's very interesting about that, Natasha, is that think of any other religion or any other people group writing a book with that title. You wouldn't find a Muslim saying, "Oh, when culture hates you." You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like you wouldn't find, there's certain beliefs that are popular within culture even, in that regard, and if in other words, and this segues me into my next question, there's something you write about with the common good and going forth with what is true, whether it's popular or not. How do you define that? Talk about the common good. What does that mean?
Yeah, so When Culture Hates You is the title, but the subtitle is very long and hard to remember, unlike the title. It's persevering for the common good as
Yes.
Christians in a hostile public square. So very long, but very important, because this is really the thrust of the book is when the culture hates you, when that's the case, and you have this hostility, let's understand that. But in light of it, how do we persevere for the common good? And so, how do you define the common good? A lot of people have some baggage with this term. Some people have never heard it, and then other people have a little bit of baggage with it because it's a term that's been used by many people in many different ways. In fact, when I first posted that I had this book coming out on Facebook, one of the first comments I ever got, it's like, "Yay! Here's my new book. I'm all excited." And one of the very first comments that I got was, "Oh, there's a red flag here because the common good, that's what people use to justify socialism," or something along those lines. So I
Yeah.
recognize that that people will use that differently. As I say in the book, I'm not importing any of those meanings into this. What we're talking about with the common good in a very basic sense is the flourishing that normal people want for their life in common, at any level of society. So it could be, at a county level, a city level. Most of what I'm talking about the book is for our country, so at an entire country level. So what is the common good? What is good for the flourishing of the life that we have in common? That's really what I'm talking about. But as I point out in the book, most of the culture wars that we have are over this common good. It's not, though, that one group of people are like, I want what I believe is good for society, and another group is saying, I actually want what's bad for society. We call those people antisocial. We call them psychopaths sometimes, right? We have all kinds of names for that kind of mentality, like I want to destroy society, right? Normally speaking, normally functioning people want what they believe is good for society. The question is, what is actually good for society?
Yes.
What is truly good for society? And a lot of times I think Christians have fallen into the trap of thinking, well, we all have different opinions about that, so I guess we're just going to enter the ring and we're all going to battle it out. But Christians have to be really clear that if Christianity is true, then what the Bible teaches corresponds to reality, and there's one good. There's one definition of good, because God himself is the only standard for what is good. So if culture is not using God as their standard for determining what's good, which of course culture doesn't, they're going to get their notion of the common good wrong in many cases. Not in every case, because sometimes these things will happen to line up, but you are going to know that you're never going to consistently be in line with God's standards when you're choosing other standards, such as how people feel, the amount of freedom they want to have, all these kinds of things. And so for the Christian, we have to be really clear that the common good has to be rooted in God himself, that is how we have to define good, not by any of culture standards.
You know what it reminds me of is Thanos in the Avengers. What he's trying to do is for the common good, right?
Okay.
And have you seen it? Have you seen
I
that
haven't. I'm not a movie person. I'm sorry, I cannot join in this to say, yes, it's just like Thanos.
You will, Natasha, you will get so many memes and so many inside jokes if you watch Avengers Endgame.
Okay, life goals.
Yeah, basically, in short, he's trying to get the Infinity Stones because he's trying to wipe out half of the population in order for it to thrive in the long run. And everybody's trying to stop him. And he's like, it's basically for the common good. I'm doing this for you kind of thing. And the ethics behind that are so interesting. In fact, my seminary professor, it was in an ethics class, a Christian ethics class, that he brought up this example. And he's like, yeah, this is what this is. Like, is it for the common good? And so it was really interesting for you to break that down, because I know that there's some people that might be confused with that definition.
Yeah, and that's a whole other, example of, do we give up the individual good for the common good? Because you can have all kinds of bad outcomes from that. And I think sometimes that's what people have in mind by it. And you can justify anything in the name of the common good, right?
Exactly.
You could justify anything by saying, well, we're going to kill off a few people, but it's for the common good. So we have to be really clear on what good actually is, because we also have to be considering the individual good. So saying that something's for the common good doesn't need to imply that it's not also for the individual good. In fact, in the book, what I really emphasize is understanding what it means to be for the individual good. What it means that if we are people, human beings who are made in the image of God, and we are actually created with given purpose, and given the reality of our sin nature, and putting all these theological pieces together about anthropology, who is mankind. I talk about that in the book. When we put those pieces together, then we're in a position to determine what is actually good for people on both an individual level as well as a societal level for everyone. So the common good is not meant to imply, in my usage of it, that we should do something to cover up what could be bad for individuals. It's, hey, how do we talk about what's good for individuals and therefore what's good for groups of individuals?
Exactly. Yes. And there's so much more in the book, you guys. You're going to have to get the book to kind of uncover, because this is just one area of that Natasha writes about. So make sure that you get the book to know more about this. But I'm going to segue into some meat into your book. Okay. So every time you write a book, this is what I love about the way that you write, is that you cover these things head on with such poise. And there's two topics that you talk about. The first one I'm going to ask you about is Christian nationalism. You are one of the only Well, that's not true. I would say that there's other authors, Christian authors out there that have covered it. But the way that you cover it specifically in your book, like you devote a pretty good, like a whole chapter to Christian nationalism and beyond, I would say, to what this is. And it's a topic that I think a lot of Christians are like, oh, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go there. We have such confusion over what this is. So first, can you define, let's just define for me what Christian nationalism is, and if it's good, bad, somewhere in between. Give us somewhere where we can have some traction with this.
So I can't give you a perfect definition because no one's using the word in the same way.
Yeah.
So that's the irony of this whole thing. There's
Oh,
no
modern word.
yeah, you can't even really, like, in other cases you could look back at a whole history of a word, for example, and say, well, this is what it's always meant, and today there are some differences on that, but this is the standard. With Christian nationalism, you really can't, because if you ask 100 people what it is, you're going to get 100 different answers. And so that's the starting place for the conversation, is just, if somebody is ever wanting to engage on that question, you have to ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Because it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing depending on what someone's definition is. So for purposes of my book, the first part of the book, 5 chapters, kind of sets up all these foundational concepts about the common good, like we were talking about, and why the hate, and when the common good is political, answering some objections, things like that. The second half of the book, then I take 5 of the most pressing and urgent issues in our culture today that I feel Christians really need more understanding of with respect to advocating for the common good. And these are also, at the same time, subjects where we get a lot of hostility. So that's how Christian nationalism ends up in the book. That chapter is called Dangerous Christian Nationalists, because that's how the media sees us. So it's the view from mainstream media. So I'm specifically addressing how mainstream media uses the term Christian nationalism against Christians. That's my purpose with that chapter, because honestly, most of the conversation, the vast majority of the conversation really that's going on around this term comes from the mainstream media.
Yes.
So if we look at what mainstream media means by it, see, I had to give you this whole backdrop for it because it's such a confusing topic. But when you dig into it, there are hundreds of thousands of hits if you were to Google Christian nationalism. And so there's no way that you can aggregate that in some kind of automated way where it's like, okay, in 58% of the cases, they're talking about this. You can't do that. So what I did is just manually surveyed hundreds of pieces of content online from various media outlets, all kinds of mainstream media, to see if they are talking about quote unquote Christian nationalism in their headlines. What examples are they giving in the content itself to help me understand, okay, this is what they think Christian nationalism is.
Okay.
So this is, I'm kind of backing into it because, again, everyone's using it in such different ways. When you do that, what you find is that in the vast majority of cases, what they're calling Christian nationalism is really Christians who are advocating for their views as public policy rooted in a biblical understanding of the world. So, translation, if you're advocating for conservative, unpopular positions that progressives hate, you are now a Christian nationalist. That is the case the vast majority of the time. So, for example, if you look up an article that talks about dangerous Christian nationalism that is theocratic and anti-democratic, and you start to read what they're talking about, they'll be talking about how Christians are advocating for pro-life causes. They'll be talking about how Christians are anti-trans and trying to push through bills to prevent kids from using puberty blockers, for example. So when you start looking at the examples they're giving, you're thinking, wait a second, how is this any different than anyone else advocating for their views, right? They just label this Christian nationalism because it's coming from Christians, and we want to, quote unquote, impose our values nationally. That's the language that they're using. Now, I can keep going if you want, or you can jump in here with a question.
A follow-up question. Yeah. You're right, because every time I've ever heard this, with some exceptions, which I'll get into in a second, anytime I've ever heard the term used, it's in a derogatory way.
Yes.
And what I have heard people pose it as is that Christians are like trying to take over America. Like you said theocracy. And I think, okay, like a dominion kind of thing. Like you're trying to take over America. You're trying to impose like Old Testament law in America. And what do you think about that? Throw some corrections at me. Like, what do you think of as far as if that definition is correct, and are there Christians actually trying to impose that?
Yeah, this is a really good point. So there are theological discussions that take place, especially on X, in different corners of the internet,
Yes.
that are more in terms of like the theological aspects of, should we be advocating for some kind of official Christianity at some level in our country? I'm not addressing that in the book. Those are some other discussions that are taking place. But because my book is focused on how the culture sees us with respect to these things, I'm not looking at those particular conversations, because here's the kicker. Those are the conversations you would think the mainstream media would be more concerned with, because those are actually looking at, can we make Christianity some kind of official religion, or recognize
Yeah,
in some official way? You'd think that that's
that's a
what
good
they're
point.
going after. They're not.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen an article. I've never pulled up an article that is like, MSNBC coming along and saying, yeah, look at these conversations where they're talking about the theology of this and looking back at history, and, should we have these Christian leaders? I mean, no one is actually talking about that. That's the great irony. What they're concerned with is stuff that they shouldn't be concerned with, even
Yes.
from a civic perspective, because this is just how our democracy is intended to work. So they're expressing concerns that we're advocating based on our religious motivations, basically, that we want, pro-life policies. That's the way a democracy works. We all bring our views to bear
Yes.
in the public square. It's not anti-democratic in any way. It's not theocratic. As I talk about in the book, just get to some basic definitions. Theocracy means that you're formally recognizing a deity as the official deity of your country.
Yeah.
Well, they're not pointing to any of those cases. When you look at these articles or you look at these videos, they're not giving cases like that where Christians are doing that. So they're calling it theocratic and they're calling it anti-democratic. They're saying it's extreme and pervasive and dangerous, but it's only dangerous because we want our views to be imposed on someone else. And as I go through a lot of explanation on in the book, that's just the nature of public policy. In every single public policy, you're imposing one group's views on someone else. If
Yes.
it's a speed limit, even, you're imposing the view that there should be a speed limit at this level on those who don't think that there should be. Murder being wrong. Well, you're imposing the view of the vast majority of people that murder is wrong on those who are like, hey, I wish that we could just do whatever we want because I'm pretty mad right now. Right? So this is just the nature of public policy. It's not an imposition in any way that any other group is not making themselves. It's all rhetoric. It's all rhetoric. And what they do, I know this is a long answer to your
No, keep
question,
going.
but let me just
I'm
give
with
you
you.
one more
Keep going.
example.
Yeah.
What they do to push this through, so it's a little bit less obvious, is that they'll come up with examples sometimes that are truly cringeworthy. I mean, like, a Christian holding up a sign,
Yes.
that just says something ridiculous, like Trump is my savior. Things like that make you go, oh my gosh, like take the sign down. But they'll post a picture like that with the article. You see the examples that they give, but they've posted it with something problematic, and they put it all together as one package of problematic things, whereas it's not actually problematic in the content. It's just that they're giving you, look at this picture, look how awful this is. And then it builds it up in people's heads as like, oh my gosh, Christian nationalism is this dangerous, scary, awful
Yes.
thing.
Yes. So it's basically a propaganda tool.
It
And
is in a lot of cases, yes.
it's very interesting. That's a very good point that you brought up about the problematic theology that Christians are addressing, right? Like that we're looking at this and we're like, oh, I don't think that's right, brother. I think you got that wrong, or whatever it is. And we are, in a really ironic way, in agreement on that, right? Where it's like, I don't think that taking over America and imposing, the laws of Deuteronomy on, people is, I don't know if that we need to have in-house conversation about that, right? And ironically, if they were to be going after that, we would be in agreement. There would be something where, oh, okay, I can see what they're saying. But then if they bolster that and make it sound like it's this is a Christian doctrine, that would be propaganda. It would be like, okay, well, hold on. Vast majority of Christians don't actually like this or believe this. This is actually a different take for some Christians, possibly in the minority. Because I've come across Christians in certain circles that I'm assuming and this is the other thing, let me get your thoughts on this. I'm assuming that most Christians watching would view something even like dominion theology, which again is kind of like taking over certain aspects of the world of entertainment, like the 7 Mountain Mandate, kind of like in the hyper charismatic camp, and then you have theocracy. You have all these different camps that kind of look at government and and see how as Christians we can not just be a part of it, but kind of take over. I've had conversations with Christians where I will use the word Christian nationalism, and I'll say, "Yeah, no, I don't agree with that." And they look at me like, "What? You don't agree with it?" And I'm wondering in my head, how are you defining that though, right? Like how am I defining it versus how they're defining it? Because if I hear it, it's typically not it's typically in a derogatory way. So, what are your overall thoughts about what I just said and as far as how we should handle this topic as Christians in this space?
Well, I know some people are trying to, they understand what's being labeled Christian nationalism. They understand it's basically just you're a Christian conservative. And so they're kind of going the opposite way to maybe reclaim the term. And so they'll say, you know, if someone calls me a Christian nationalist, I say, yes, I am. And they're kind of like proud of that, like that they're going to
Yeah.
be a Christian nationalist. I don't personally think that's a good thing. I
Mhm.
don't think that that's going to help any of these conversations, because if you say you're a Christian nationalist, somebody is going to have surely a negative view of that you're talking to, so you're not actually engaging in the conversation about what that means, and you're probably just agreeing to a pejorative term without even realizing what you just said. So I don't think that that is helpful personally. Like I said, I think when somebody says something about, oh well, Christian nationalism is so scary, like there's a book out I saw that came out recently, How to End Christian Nationalism. you know and when people say these kinds of things, just start by asking the question, so how are you defining
Yes.
Christian
What do you mean
nationalism?
by that?
Yeah, what do you mean by that? I don't think we should be agreeing to anything, especially when we know it's a derogatory term
Yeah.
that people are using about Christians. We have to actually gain clarity. And instead of just, kind of like cleverly saying, well, I'm a Christian nationalist, if we take the time to understand what they're saying, and they say things like, well, a lot of Christians want to impose their own views, their religious views on other people, that's a great opportunity to explain to that person, but wait, how are we doing anything that's not intended by a democracy
Yeah.
from the get-go, right?
And
So we,
how is
we
it
can
that
help
they're not
educate.
doing it either? Like, are they not
Right,
doing this either? Everybody's
exactly.
legislating their morality.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so it gives us an opportunity to educate others, and especially when they say something like, oh, but there's separation of church and state. Well, that's just a misunderstanding of how church and state are, quote unquote separate. And I tackle that and address it and explain all that in the
Yes.
book also. But I just wanted to make an interesting note, I think, about the NAR stuff in terms of like the 7 Mountain Mandate and,
Mm-hmm.
taking control of institutions. To my understanding, and I could be wrong on this, but to my understanding, they are not trying to have a completely different form of government, but rather they are their theology is leading them to want to take over influence of all these different areas of society. So they kind of have this whole framework for doing that. Let's take over the influence here and here and here and here. So as Christians who don't adhere to that particular theology,
Mm-hmm.
we might not agree with the theology behind it or their motivation for doing it. We might not go along with the whole 7 Mountain Mandate thing, but the end result for them is very similar to what it would be for like us in talking about this conversation, that we want to influence government, advocate for the things that are good in society. We want to limit evil. And so we actually end up working for a lot of the same things, even though we're coming from different motivations and maybe a different theological background, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting to me, because a lot of people will bring up the problems with the whole the theology behind that, and that's a theological question. But when we're just talking about influence in the public square, to
Mm.
my understanding, they're seeking the same type of influence that we would be when we don't adhere to that same theology per se. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
a lot of it has to do with their eschatology
Mm-hmm.
and bringing Jesus back, signs, wonders, miracles.
Yes.
Like, there's a lot to that. For more information on that, guys, check out Holly Pivik and Doug Ivet's book, Counterfeit Kingdom. They really talk a lot about this. I'll leave a link to it in the description. But there's another topic I really want to pick your mind on. I don't know how we're going to get through this conversation without talking about chapter 10. This was the most shocking chapter to me. And it's basically, here, actually, I wrote this down. You said the goal for a subset of LGBTQ activists is to free children from the sexual restrictions placed on them by society's norms, values, and expectations. Okay, let's start there. Help us understand how we got to this point right here.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say about how we got to that point. I want to clarify for people what I mean when I say what you just read there.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the sexual liberation of children and that there's a subset of activists who are working toward this. I want people to really understand we're not talking about something broadly as what sometimes people call the sexualization of children. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, when people are talking about rightly how we need to work against the sexualization of children, what they're talking about is that there's all kinds of LGBTQ themes that are coming into children's entertainment or books in libraries and in different places. And, there's definitely this push toward, hey, there needs to be acceptance amongst kids of different ways of being, as they would say it, that there needs to be this acceptance of different genders and different sexualities. And when most people are thinking about this subject, that's what they're talking about. The kids should not be exposed to this. There shouldn't be this push toward getting acceptance of all this. That's not what I'm talking about in this chapter. All that is true, all that is happening, all that is problematic. But what I'm talking about is far more troubling and problematic. And that is that some people actually want to take away any idea that there is such a thing as childhood innocence, that children are basically sexual beings themselves, that all humans are sexual beings, so that extends to children, and children should be able to have sexual pleasure themselves. Yeah. That's different. That's different than just saying we want children to accept in some way these different ideas about gender and sexuality, to accept everything as normal. I think most people understand there's been a push toward normalization of these ideas, and that's why we see the cartoons that have these themes. That's why we see it in movies for kids. That's why we see all that. Yes, that's happening, but there's also a group of people who want to remove any of those taboos so that children can participate themselves. I think, in a common term, we would call that pedophilia, right? I mean, that's just what it is. But there are many people who are working toward this, and it is a subset of activism. Mm-hmm. So do you want to get into kind of some of those historical points?
I would love to. You name 3 players. I know Freud is one of them. Kinsey, there's Kinsey reports. Talk about all of it. Yes.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to the sexual revolution over, say, the last 100 years, but I kind of just try to boil it down as succinctly as possible to 3 key moments. There's Freud, there's Kinsey, and then there's queer theory. Mm-hmm. So starting with Freud, many people had written before Freud, this wasn't new to him, about how happiness was the central goal of life. But Freud was the one who kind of came along and married happiness being the central goal to sexual pleasure is what will bring you the greatest happiness. So when you put those things together, the most important thing in life for Freud is sexual pleasure. And so he sees everything through that lens, that we don't just experience sexual pleasure, but that we are actually beings who our entire identity is who we are sexually in terms of how we have sexual pleasure. So we had famously the different stages of development where, he's tracing even from an infant stage. It's not all kinds of development as you grow up. It's how do you develop sexually as you grow up. Everything is seen through this lens. So anytime today where these conversations are being had about how society thinks that your sexuality is your identity, that all goes back to Freud. He's the one that really married those things and made it so that that was how this was seen. So then fast forward a few decades, and what you get is this guy, Alfred Kinsey, who is a sexologist, basically. And he gave, through his work, if we want to call it work, that's just a nice term for some of the horrible things that he put together. Mm-hmm. But he basically put together this research to scientifically validate some of what Freud had said. And so I talk about in the book the disturbing details of how he did this, but he actually documented from every age from infant on up, how these children were experiencing sexual pleasure and the physiological response they had. And he made sure that it wasn't just, yeah, they experienced some kind of physical sensation, but he made sure to show that by recording the observations, by reporting on the observations of this happening, that it was to show that they are also enjoying it. I know it's really hard to even say out loud. I kind of hate
Yes.
describing all this because it's so
It
dreadful.
was
But
hard to read. It
that's
was shocking. Yeah.
yeah, and he's basically taking this data from child molesters or a child molester, depending. There's a whole debate over exactly how he got his data there,
Hmm.
but that's what it is. It's a child molester who's collecting this data basically on the responses that children have had, and it's absolutely crazy that he is a respected person in history in a lot of places. Like Indiana University has a whole center dedicated to him and his work on sexuality, and yet this is what he brought to the world. So you've got Freud, who basically says that you are a sexual being, that your identity is your sexuality, and then you have Kinsey, who gives this supposedly scientific validation to all of it, and then you have queer theory that comes along later and basically says that all norms all norms are bad, that there should be no norms of gender and sexuality, that
Hmm.
everything should be pushed against. So I think sometimes when people hear the words queer theory, they're thinking queer in terms of gay because those two words have been used synonymously a lot. But queer theory, very specifically, is not about being gay. Queer theory is about getting rid of all norms of gender and sexuality. So there is no such thing as male and female. That's just a social construct, according to queer theory.
Hmm.
So they're rebelling against this idea of what they would call cis heteronormativity, that
Hmm.
there are only two genders and that to be heterosexual is normal. Well, here's how that plays into the history with Kinsey and Freud. They were basically getting rid of all the social constructs around sexuality. Specifically, queer theory adds in gender, but is often talking about age as a social construct.
Yes.
So if you go and you Google childhood innocence and queer theory, you will pull up academic articles in these journals and publications that are talking about how supposedly harmful it is, that there is a societal idea that children are innocent sexually. And as they would make the case, children are sexual beings like anyone else. Who are we as a society to say that they shouldn't be engaging sexually? It's really, really, truly heavy and disturbing. It's the final chapter in my book where I talk about all of this, and it left me feeling just the weight of the world like never before, which I even say in my epilogue. I just felt the evil of the world. But no one's
Yes.
talking, I don't want to say no one's talking about this, but most people aren't talking about this particular issue. There are a lot of people who are talking about issues of sexuality. Some people who are talking about sexuality as it's being introduced to kids to gain acceptance of the LGBTQ community, but not enough people understand what's going on at this deeper level, where activists are acknowledging that, hey, childhood innocence is just a social construct. We need to get rid of it so children can experience sexual pleasure too.
Maybe they think it's on the fringe, right? Where they're like, it's not that big of a deal. There's not that many people talking about it. There's no way, right? There's no way that society could accept this. What would your response be to that?
Well, you can read for yourself what's going on online, and I think what I would say to that is let's use Drag Queen Story Hour as a case
Yeah.
study of it. Most people think that Drag Queen Story Hour is, this, like, I would say most Christians believe that it's a problematic thing. They don't think that kids should be exposed to these men who are dressing up in drag and doing these performances, which are often sexualized in some way. So most Christians recognize, okay, this is a problem, but they don't know that it's a problem for more reasons than that. That there are actually papers that have been written, one in particular that I talk about in my chapter, where one of the people on the board of Drag Queen Story Hour, he's a drag queen himself, and he co-authored a paper called Drag Pedagogy that I talk about in
Yeah.
this chapter.
Hmm.
And in that paper, they basically explain that the purpose of Drag Queen Story Hour is not to teach kids about quote unquote queer lives, but how to live queerly themselves, resisting all the norms of gender and sexuality, even
They're
from an early
evangelizing.
age.
Yeah.
So they are saying it themselves that this is the purpose of what's going on. And I think that they're using what I call mainstream allies, meaning people who broadly support LGBTQ ideas and the LGBTQ community and are like, yes, I'm going to take my kids to Drag Queen Story Hour because I want to be supportive and I want to teach my kids about things. I think that they're using them as I don't know what else to say, as useful idiots, as
I was
people.
I was literally thinking of that
I mean,
exact
I
word.
hate to say it that bluntly. Like, I wouldn't
No,
normally say
I
something
was
like
gonna say
that,
it myself.
but it really is. It's like they know. Like I
Mhm.
said, you can read this paper about Drag Queen Story Hour, and they know that their purposes are different than what most people think. I mean, they basically said that they use some of the marketing language in ways that can justify the educational value, even though that's not what it's really about. I mean, you can go and you can read this stuff for yourself from someone who sits on the board
Yeah.
of Drag Queen Story Hour. And so, when people are gladly marching their kids along to Drag Queen Story Hour, they're going along with it. They're being used by people, by activists who actually have some very different goals. And I mean, I just want to add, I'm not claiming every single person involved in Drag Queen Story Hour, including some of the drag queens themselves, are purposely doing that, what this particular board member is saying. I think they might have other goals that are equally problematic. But what I am saying is that when you know that this is how a subset of people are actually treating this and how they see it, then we have to realize that Drag Queen Story Hour has become pretty mainstream. Lots of just everyday moms take their kids to this and they think that this is a really good thing. So going back to your original question, what do you say to people who would say it's like a fringe thing? Well, you might think it's fringe, but they're using some pretty mainstream ways of taking their fringe view and normalizing it.
Mm-hmm. Because it's so
So
accepted.
yeah, so that it becomes a way of getting through what they're trying to do in a way that people don't even realize. So
Mm-hmm.
of course, you're going to see this come along. It's the same thing with pride parades that are labeled family friendly. There are many articles and many examples of so-called family friendly pride parades where some really bad stuff has happened in front of kids. So they've encouraged kids to go, and then they've been doing things at those pride events that are clearly designed to get kids to experience things and to see things that they shouldn't. And
Yeah.
honestly, the books, I think a lot of people have heard about the problematic books that are in a lot of school libraries.
Yeah.
These books are not there to simply represent LGBTQ ideas. And that is a way that these activists are really fooling people too. Because a lot of people are like, well, representation is important. We want, characters who represent the LGBTQ community and we want them to be exposed to these ideas. This is pornography. When you
Yeah.
actually look at the books, they're getting mainstream allies to be their useful idiots, to
Yes.
be the ones who are like, but we need these LGBTQ books. They're not just books about being LGBTQ. They're books that use pornography and attach it to something that the mainstream allies want to support. And they feel like they're against that community. If they try to take these books out themselves, no one wants to be against LGBTQ people. And so they say, no,
Mm-hmm.
these are important. This is important that kids can see people like them and this kind of thing. It's pornography. If you look at these books, it is appalling. And
Mm-hmm.
so anyone who doubts what I'm saying, who is like, no, but they're not that bad. There are different organizations. I think one is called takebacktheclassroom.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I verify that and then put it in a link to the show notes so people can look at it.
Yeah.
But at that site, they're documenting the books that are being found in different libraries, and you can see the pages yourself. You won't believe it. You
Mm-hmm.
won't believe it. But when you look at that, you're going to see all this stuff is coming in under the guise of, hey, we want to be accepting of LGBTQ people, but this is getting attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be able to separate those in our minds.
Yes.
That was a really long answer to your
No,
question, but it's
you could
important
keep
people realize
talking.
this is not a fringe issue.
Yeah.
It
No,
might be that not many people have accepted the idea yet, but they're working on it. And given the tools they have at their disposal with school libraries and Drag Queen Story Hour, Pride Parades, and all these things, it will make its way eventually.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that's so good. So okay, I have putting the title, considering everything you just said. Imagine a drag queen writing a book with this title, When Culture Hates You. And they're talking about how they're not accepted. Everybody hates their message of, taking children aren't innocent, and everything that you just said. And they're talking about this message that they're getting out there in the name of what they think is the common good. What would you say is wrong with that?
To the drag queen
Yeah.
themselves?
Yeah. It's an on the head question, but I
Yeah.
think that the way that you're going to answer it is probably the way I would answer it. But I think here's my reason for answering or asking that is that imagine for a second that somebody's watching this, and I've heard progressive Christians say the same thing. They think they're the ones that are hated. They think they are the ones that are hated by culture. And I'm like, how are you hated when you're accepting everything that culture loves, right? So I'm thinking if they're watching this, they might have the opposite idea, and I want you to speak to that.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's such an important point. I would say this to that person. I would say that what it comes down to is our different definitions of love and hate.
Yes.
So, love and hate require some kind of standard, something that allows us to determine what is loving and what is hateful, just like the words good and bad and right and wrong, harmful and helpful. All of those kinds of words that have a moral dimension to them require a standard of some kind. So, as a Christian, I believe that God exists, and not only that God exists, but that God has revealed himself to the world through his word, which is the Bible. And so I don't have to guess that God thinks this or that. I believe that God has said, and that God has revealed what is truly good and truly bad and truly harmful and truly helpful. And so if I'm going to use those words according to the standard of God himself, then when I'm concerned about what you as a drag queen are doing and the messages that you're promoting, when I'm concerned about that, it's because I actually love you and I love other people also. And that love is rooted first and foremost in my love for God. Mm-hmm. So when we as Christians love God, we want to do what he commands, and we want to base our understanding of love on what he says. And so I want God's best for you. That's the definition of love. And I want God's best for you, even if you feel like that's hateful. The Bible would say that our feelings can be misleading to us. And I don't believe that what I'm saying is hateful. I believe that it's rooted in what God himself has said is best for you and best for others.
Yeah. And what corresponds to reality, the moral law, these things that imply who God is, that this is who he is and why we have that standard. So yeah, it was really well said. Yeah.
And I think too, like in conversations like this, I try to help people understand first before I even get to is Christianity true? Like the apologetics part of it.
Yeah.
I in the last few years, I've really moved more toward a let's just try to understand each other's worldviews first and how those differ. Yes. Because in that case, my whole goal with that answer that I naturally gravitated to wasn't, well, this is true and this is what I said, but rather I believe that, these things are true. And if those things are true, then here are the implications of that. If I were to continue, having that conversation with that person, I would want to make sure that they understand, like, so if you don't, and let's just pretend that I know what they believe about God and I have that to work from. If I were talking to them and I knew that, I could say, now I understand that you don't believe in God, and so you're going to have a very different view on all of these things. But if you did believe in God, and that this God that you believed in gave a book that said, here's how to love people best, can you understand why you would believe that those things are loving? Because it came from the God of the universe, the creator of the universe. Even if you don't agree that he exists and that the Bible is his word, can you at least understand where I'm coming from and why I believe that what I'm saying is loving? Mm-hmm. And then the flip side of that, I would want to express my understanding of his position, right? Like, and I understand totally. And I've had these conversations with people in exactly the way I'm describing right now. And I think it's so important to set it up this way, because at least if you can understand, okay, well, here are the implications of your view, here are the implications of mine. Now the question is, well, which view is the correct view of reality? Yes. I think that's a more helpful way of doing it, because I think it's very helpful for a lot of people to hear you say, now, if the person's an atheist, I'm just using this as an example, I understand you don't believe that a God exists. And so if a God doesn't exist, then we're each on our own to kind of figure out, what is right and wrong. And so from that perspective, you think that what I'm saying is bad and it's harmful because who am I to judge? Who am I to say anything, right? And I would say, you know what? I actually totally agree with you that if that is the accurate picture of the world, that there is no God, there is no moral lawgiver, I actually totally agree with you that I shouldn't be here with any objective basis for telling you this is wrong. So if that's true, I get you. I totally get you. I just want you to understand that because this is what I believe, these are going to be the implications of that. So that if that were true, if what I believe is true, then I am loving you and I'm not hating you. And so once you've separated those out, then you can get into more of the apologetics of, but I do want to point out that, if there is no God, there's no objective basis for you telling me that I'm wrong, right? Everything is just relative. So those are just, some different ways that you can approach these. And, if you just have 2 minutes with someone, obviously you can't get that deep into it. But if you're having a more extended conversation, that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think it's just seek first to understand. Like with a genuine curiosity, just to kind of know where you're at and then seek to be understood. This is so good. This is great. Is there anything that you want to leave my viewers with? Maybe some tidbits of advice or something that they can walk away from this interview with to give them hope and direction?
Yeah, I think that we didn't talk a lot about the political aspect. What about when the common good is political and that kind of thing? But I would just say that in the last year, we have seen so much confusion in the church, especially when it came to the election, about some things that become like mantras that we hear that Christians have come to believe, but have a really weak basis.
Like what? What's a mantra?
Like for example, Christians shouldn't seek power. We hear this so often that we start to come to believe, well, that's just a thing, right? We're not supposed to seek power. But if we're not thinking deeply about that, we're going to come to believe some things that will lead us to not actually be the light that we should be in society. And I mean, we're trying to wrap up, so I'm not going to go off on that one. But, power is just the ability and authority to execute a governing role.
I was just going to ask you to define it.
It can be used well or it can be used poorly, right? There's nothing inherently bad about power. If we want to steward power well and we want to put those in government who steward power well so that they're advocating for the good and they're restraining evil, as the Bible says is the purpose of government, we should absolutely be doing that. And so I bring up that example because I think that Christians have not heard a lot in churches that will disciple them in thinking well about these ideas about public engagement. So my advice to people is don't kind of take on the culture's mantras or the warnings from culture about, oh, well, Christians should or should not be doing this. Test it against the Bible. Does the Bible say that we should or should not be doing this? And we need to think through that deeply because the world needs Christians to be salt and light. The world is enslaved to sin, and it's going to continue to be enslaved to sin. So as Christians, we have to have a really good understanding of our role so that we can shine light in the darkness and do that in a way that glorifies God. So that would be my encouragement to people.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, guys. Go out and get this book. It's releasing February 4th, right?
Yep.
So by the time that this interview comes out, it'll probably be just coming out or already out. When Culture Hates You. Again, I read and endorsed the book. Great cover, by the way. Everything that we talked about and more, links to more resources will be in the description of this video for you guys to check out. And Natasha, I want to thank you so much for coming on my channel today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you as always.